Hi, I'm Jim Posner, and this is the Don't Panic Project. We provide conversations to help empower, inspire, and educate people suffering from stress, anxiety, and depression. Today's guest is Andrew Luecke. Andrew is a writer and editor whose work has appeared in Esquire, Complex, and High Snobiety. He is the co-author of the book Cool, Sound, Style, and Subversion, A History of Youth Subcultures, which Refinery29 hailed as required reading. Andrew has also been quoted in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, and the Los Angeles Times. He lives in Brooklyn and loves dogs. So, first of all, Andrew, welcome to the Don't Panic Project.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. So I came across Andrew by reading a really interesting titled article in the Huffington Post a couple of months ago, and the article was titled, "I have a terrifying type of OCD you probably haven't heard of." So hats off to the people that write titles, because that one definitely got my attention, and I was like, this sounds very interesting, and I read the article, and yes, it is very interesting. But before we get into this particular type of OCD, can you tell us a little bit about how you grew up, where you come from?
Sure. I grew up in Colorado, Boulder, Colorado, and then I went to high school in Denver. I'm an only child. My parents are still together. Had a really happy, pretty easy childhood. My father is an environmentalist, specializing in water issues in the West, or was. He's retired now. Both my parents are retired now. And my mother was a psychotherapist, just always active, always into sports, skiing, skateboarding, stuff like that. I liked school, and it was, I would say it was a relatively normal, uneventful, childhood, a good childhood.
Awesome. So interesting. Your mom was a psychotherapist.
Right.
Maybe we'll get back to that as we get deeper into this OCD that you suffered from. So tell us, when was the first time you realized that something might be remiss?
Well, again, and as I said in the story, it really started there when I was about 14 years old. I started having intrusive thoughts about harming people. They'd be, very, very graphic sometimes, and sort of pop into my head. Immediately accompanied and followed by panic, which sort of made them really hard to sort out. And again, these were thoughts that I definitely knew I didn't want to act on. You know what I mean? I think I wrote the article there once. It started when I was about 14. My parents were out of town. A woman was babysitting me, and I just kept thinking, what if I murder this woman in my sleep? While she's sleeping, I'm sleepwalking. So sometimes they would present themselves in ways where I wouldn't even be consciously able to control the actions that I was having, that I was thinking about. You know what I'm saying? So I would say, I don't want to hurt this person, but what if I do it while I'm sleepwalking? What if I do it? What if I black out? What if I black out in a rage? Things like that. And another example I said was once, a couple years later, when I learned to drive around 16. What if I run over a kid in the street? And I would circle back and forth. So it started early teens. And would kind of go off and on, and it was just very confusing. Hurting someone else was my greatest fear, which is sort of how this form of OCD presents itself. People become obsessed with those things that they might fear the most. So for me, it was hurting someone else unintentionally or not wanting to, and maybe being forced to in some way. Since I've learned more about it, sometimes people will have the same sort of OCD hangups about religious blasphemy if they're very religious people. So it's sort of these things people hold most dear. And I knew I didn't want to act on them. And at the same time, if you're having this persistent thought of harming someone, it's like, and it's accompanied by panic, making it even harder to sort out. It's like, well, do I want to act on this? And because of the mechanism of the OCD, I would fixate on those intrusive, scary thoughts and sort of spin out in a cycle of anxiety. And it would come and go sort of through my teens, maybe really present itself really strongly and really perturb me for, daily, for a couple months, and then it would subside. And kind of went on like that. Sometimes I would go years without really having, really getting caught up in the OCD and the panic. I would maybe have the intrusive thoughts, but if I was doing well in other things or really busy with other things, I would sort of be able to not fixate on those intrusive thoughts and just move past them. And then sometimes it would come back. And then, by the time I was in my late 20s, and again, this is all different thoughts of harming people in different various ways. But by the time I was in my late 20s, it really came back strong and sort of took me down, for 3 or 4 months. And that's, when I decided I really needed to seek therapy.
So the thoughts that you were having, were they extremely graphic? Like, did you have these thoughts of you physically? I mean, it's one thing to like kind of accidentally run over somebody in the road, but it's another thing like your babysitter you're talking about. Were these like graphic images of you kind of, I don't know what was like the...
I don't love to always get into the details right, because they are really graphic and gory, but yes, they would be extremely hands-on, very graphic, very disturbing, images of me going through these acts of harming people in various ways. And,
all right, well,
accompanied by the anxiety and panic, sometimes they would almost feel physical, almost like I was feeling the sensations of like having done it. And that's another hallmark of this form of purely obsessional OCD, is sometimes the intrusive thoughts feel so real to sufferers, and the anxiety and panic is so extreme that they actually end up wondering if they may have acted on these terrible thoughts. Again, sleepwalking, or in a way I couldn't control myself.
Right, almost in a subconscious way, like in a way that you were not controlling.
Exactly. And then that's another thing, like, am I, consciously I don't want to harm these people, but maybe I'm having these thoughts. Is it coming from my subconscious, this and that?
Right.
So I mean, it would be almost physical feelings and almost occasionally sensations of what it would feel like, or wondering if it did feel like this to harm these people. So very, very, very detailed, very intense. And I mean, I guess the nature of the OCD is they would just sort of, arise as intrusive thoughts, could be fully formed and very elaborate and sort of very detailed, just almost immediately,
Yeah. So, again, this is an interview series called the Don't Panic Project. And the goal is to really help people that might be suffering through all types of different stress, anxiety, depression, whatever it might be. So, I want to get into it. And I'm just curious. So when you have the thoughts, and I know from reading the article, you talk a little bit about, constantly having to go and check back, like when you're driving. So can you maybe go into a little detail about that? And I guess is this the real, where the OCD really kind of sets in, where you're
exactly. It's the checking that sort of ends up fueling the thought process. So like, for example, worried about harming that woman who was babysitting me, for example, would go back and check on her, or see her in the morning just to make sure she wasn't harmed. And of course she never was. And just like did I run over a kid in the street with my car on accident, circle back. As I said in the article, sometimes I would even check police reports for months and months and months.
Wow.
And it's that checking that really fuels the process. As I eventually found the right therapy later on, and we can talk about that later on, I discovered that the sort of the cycle of what they call pure O, and they call it purely obsessional OCD because it doesn't manifest itself with outward rituals like the more commonly known form of OCD does. So, I mean, in more commonly form of OCD, people will respond to these intrusive thoughts and anxieties with ritualization. So, famous ones are having to wash your hands 6 times every time you have a thought, or people will want to have to turn the light switch on 3 or 4 times before they leave a room, things like that. But in the purely obsessional, it's almost entirely in the mind, and sort of it's not out and out ritualization, but it's the checking that fuels this OCD. So basically the way the process happens is an intrusive thought will arise. It'll be something disturbing. It varies depending on people's values and people's experiences. And whereas someone who's not suffering from the pure O would sort of, just maybe breeze by the thought, think maybe, oh, that's a weird thought, whatever. The person with the pure O will get hung up on it because it's so disturbing, and it'll be so disturbing to them that it'll fuel the anxiety. The anxiety will make the person want to check that this thought hasn't become a reality. But once you get the anxiety involved in the loop, and then once you begin checking on the anxiety, I guess basically the way it works is by checking, you are validating that this thought is actually a threat in reality, sort of to your body, to your brain, to your system. And so every time you check, it strengthens the panic response because it's a fear response, and validates it to the system. And then it just kind of, is a feedback loop that speeds out of control and fuels it. And there's a big component of it. It's the ambiguity that actually gets people, I learned. This sort of desire to know the certainty, as opposed to just sort of being able to deal with the ambiguity and say sort of like, well, I probably didn't hurt this person. We're just going to not check. And
right.
And then later on in the therapeutic process, I learned that a big part of learning to manage this pure obsessional OCD is sort of accepting the ambiguity of it.
Is it accepting the what?
Accepting the ambiguity of
Gotcha.
the situation, not always giving into your desire to check and have certainty about these thoughts. And you sort of learn. I mean, it sounds almost counterintuitive, and it's really, really scary. So anybody who thinks that they're maybe suffering from something like this, I mean, the right type of therapy is really important, because it's scary to sort of say at first, yeah, maybe you kind of have to say, yeah, maybe I did. Who knows? Maybe I did do my greatest fear. Who knows? And at first, that sounds almost to sufferers, or almost feels like you're an admission or something like that. But I mean, in order to get the right therapist, you learn how to sort of deal with the ambiguity, or expose yourself to these thoughts. It's like exposure therapy, like other phobia therapies. And once you sort of learn to accept the ambiguity, then that cycle slows down and shuts down. And
right.
You engage in the checking. But what you have to learn to do is really sort of sit through that panic. It's almost like sitting through a fire, but with the help of a good therapist, they're guiding you and supporting you. It's like once you learn to sit through that initial fire of panic, each time it's a little easier and a little less panic.
Right. I mean, there is this ironic component to this whole thing on a couple of levels, one of which you reference in your article, how you're a very empathetic person, and this is like your worst fear would be to like harm somebody, and what you were talking about also with like a deeply religious person.
Exactly.
Having, similar negative thoughts about religion. But then I think the other kind of level of irony with this is that, you're constantly checking to make sure your worst fears didn't come true. And in my mind, on a certain level, only a really good person would, just keep, I couldn't have done this, like you just.
Right, of course, and that's sort of something you sort of learn in therapy too. Is like sociopaths who do murder people,
right? Yeah,
care at all.
Yeah,
you're totally right. That is part of the irony, and it is that caring and concern that causes people to become fixated on these things.
Yeah, it's really quite fascinating.
It's very strange, and I mean, it just seems so unusual. I mean, for most people who suffer from this, they have pretty good insight, as psychotherapists call it. They're aware, sort of logically, that this doesn't add up.
Right.
This isn't making sense. And yet the panic and anxiety and emotional response, then combined with the vividness, of the imagery and the intrusive thoughts, can sort of overwhelm that, and you're sort of left with this feeling of like, well, this doesn't seem to be real at all, and yet it seems so terrifying, and then this imagery is so graphic and disturbing, I don't really know what to think. And so and then of course it's always about taboo subjects, so that also prevents people from speaking out. People who suffer from pure O, since most of them feel like it's not logical, think they're going crazy, and that's such a taboo. It's very hard to say, look, I think I'm going crazy. And then B, when the thoughts are about murder or harming children or animals or what have you, these are your worst fears, and then these are taboo topics. And so you're worried you may do this or may have even done this. You don't want to tell someone else you're thinking about murdering people, because
Right.
Most people aren't aware of this type of OCD. Most people aren't equipped to it. And, even people who might want to help you, you tell them that, and they might think, okay, well, maybe you're a danger to someone.
Right.
Not, with the intention of helping, but it's just so hard to understand for people suffering and for, the general public. And even many psychotherapists aren't aware of this sort of separate little type of OCD.
Yeah. So, I was going to jump right into how'd you get help, but before that, actually, so you alluded to having some panic attacks before you got your help, and
Right.
So, can you actually describe your panic attacks? And the reason I asked you to do this is because,
Of course.
Again, with what I'm doing here, anxiety and panic, a lot of
Mm-hmm.
people I've interviewed have had panic attacks, but I kind of have a feeling that the panic attacks that you maybe experienced are a little bit different than, I went through it, and
maybe, I don't know. So it would usually, it would start with an intrusive thought of harming someone. Again, as I've said, running over the car. Sometimes it would be like sleepwalking and murdering someone. All sorts of different scary thoughts, Sometimes it could even be something as simple as like, when I was younger, I used to work in a restaurant and you pick up broken glass, and I would think, did I dispose of that broken glass properly? Did I put this in the trash can in a way that it's going to harm the porter when he takes it out? What if he takes out the trash? I didn't put the glass in there the right way. It cuts open his femoral artery, and he
Right.
it could be all sorts of things like that. So it would start like that. And then for me, at least, it would usually be accompanied almost simultaneously or immediately by a surge of anxiety. And, for me, that would sort of, bubble up from my stomach is how it would feel to me. And then sort of shoot out through my extremities, so I really felt like I was having the adrenaline and that just coursing through my body, which itself was very overwhelming. And then it would progress on to sort of sweating a little bit. I would feel as though, my similar to what I've heard other people say about panic attacks, my line of vision was sort of tunneling in. When I would get really bad, it would be sort of hard. I'd be breathing fast and sort of hard to catch my breath. And it just combined, it would just sort of take me almost totally out of reality. The tunnel vision and the breathing and the sweating and in the stomach. Yeah. And,
did they ever get so bad that you had to go seek medical attention for the panic attack? Or?
No, I guess I was lucky. I've known other people who have had that and, have had such a bad panic attack.
Yeah.
That they would maybe be concerned they were having heart problems or really couldn't breathe.
Yeah.
For whatever reason, I probably just luck that it never went that far. But it was tremendously painful. And, sometimes it would last. Sometimes I would be existing in like just below a panic attack state for months.
Yeah.
Basically.
Yeah.
And when you're like that, you can't sleep, you can't eat. And, and then in sort of in that sub-panic attack zone, of course, it wouldn't take much to sort of put it up. But I was lucky that I never had to seek medical attention. Although on the other hand, if I had, maybe I would have learn to manage this OCD sooner, but who knows?
Right. So getting to managing this primarily obsessional obsessive compulsive disorder, this pure O. How did you find help?
Well, it got, as I said, a big hurdle for people who suffer from pure O is A, there's not that much information on it. So they often think they're the only person in the world feeling like this. B, it's terrifying stuff. C, it can feel like you're going crazy, and all of that makes people not want to share. But I was just doing so badly there in my late 20s or around age 30. I can't remember the exact years, that I eventually went to therapy. I told this therapist what I was experiencing. He was very compassionate, very helpful, but sort of reassuring that he didn't think I would or had acted on these thoughts. But he also just had never heard of pure OCD, to my knowledge. And so initially that was very helpful and relieved some of the anxiety. But it just didn't quite do it. And I went for a couple years, and it was a positive experience. He helped me with other things in my life, and but it just didn't quite do it. And I later learned when I found the proper treatment for pure O that reassurance is one of the worst things you can do for someone suffering from pure O, because just like with the checking, by reassuring, you're validating that this is even a threat at all when it's not. So after that,
so just to confirm, the reassurance is when you're checking and constantly checking.
Well, I see, right. And in the therapeutic context, I would be basically looking for reassurance from the therapist.
I see.
And he would, but that's part of the checking. And he would, provide it. Say, yeah, I don't think you're going to hurt. You're not going to hurt anyone. But that fuels the cycle. It's ultimately not helpful because, again, it's sort of validating that this is even a threat in the first place, when in reality it's not. So despite being helpful a little bit, went to that therapist. Then I went a couple years without therapy, and it just was a persistent issue in my life. And I just eventually just started searching on the internet for anything that sounded like what I'd been experiencing. And interestingly enough, I found a page on Wikipedia about intrusive thoughts, and it's still there in pretty much its same form. And I thought, oh man, this is what has been happening to me. And you read on and think, and then they maybe even have worried that they've acted on it before and harming people and blah, blah, blah. Oh man. So that was very comforting in and of itself, just to find a description of what I'd been experiencing someplace else. And, so from there, from the intrusive thoughts, I think on that page, it even mentions purely obsessional OCD. I thought, geez, that's, that really sounds right. And I actually, there's some history of OCD in my family as well. Not necessarily presenting itself exactly how my pure O did, but also, my mother and my grandfather would have fears about accidentally harming people or something. For example, my mom told me, when she was younger, almost like with what I said, working at the restaurant with the disposing of the broken glass, she would pick up broken glass on the street because she would worry that it was her responsibility to keep other people from getting hurt from this broken glass. And of course, she didn't throw the glass on the ground, and she would want to walk by it and sometimes go back. And so that was there. And so I knew, okay, pure O, and then you have the family history. This sort of adds up. And then I just kept searching about it, and then I found Center for OCD treatment here in New York City, and was able to work with a wonderful therapist, and we sorted it out. We started the exposure treatment. We started the treatment on dealing with the ambiguity, and it was hard, but it was the right treatment method, and I had a great therapist, and eventually learned to work through it. But I spent maybe 2 or 3 more years really working on it. And I mean, the way it worked with this therapy is it's like exposure therapy, similar to what they do with phobias. Another big part of the therapeutic process is when you're an anxious person, maybe outside of this, which I had been, and you're panicking and this and that, sometimes it can be just sort of a big jumble of panic. So a lot of the therapy centered around figuring out what was an OCD spike, as they call it, which is what they call that sort of thought and panic and checking process. What was a spike, aka not a real threat, and what was something that you were worrying about that, even if it was unlikely, maybe say, you could still consider that a real worry. For example, are you worrying about sleepwalking and murdering someone, which is clearly a spike, or are you worried that there's a new boss at your work and some people have been getting laid off and things are chaotic? Maybe you're next up to get laid off, which might be unlikely, but that would be a concern that's actually grounded in reality, and it's something that you might actually have to anticipate or fear. And when those are all dialed up and mixed up in the anxiety and the panic, it's very hard to sort those out. So identifying a true spike was a big part of the process, and then sort of developing therapeutic responses for when you had a spike, which would either be sort of a neutral response of okay and sort of not engage with it, or one of the alternative responses would be to sort of lean into it and sort of relish it and say, yeah, I probably did sleepwalk and murder someone, and you know what, I probably sleepwalked and murdered 50 people. And then once you sort of lean into it instead of running away, I mean, the whole thing is so counterintuitive, which makes it hard to treat, but it desensitizes you to that fear, and it almost also takes it to a place of ridiculousness for some people. And it's like, well, maybe I could have really sleepwalked and murdered one person, but I know I didn't do 50. So when you say, yeah, maybe I did 50 or something like that, and it varies for different people, and sometimes even taking it to a ridiculous level is therapeutic for people. And then so along with the identifying the spikes and the sort of therapeutic responses, then there was also like exposure therapy. You sort of get a list of tasks together with your therapist of things are going to sort of trip your panic and your intrusive thoughts, from sort of the least scary to the scariest, 1 to 10, and then over years, for me, you go through those processes and confront it. And I think my last step was like write a confession letter about harming people, and write it and read it. And it's like, it's terrifying, but it works. Like by the time you're done, it works. It's pretty interesting. It's pretty interesting. But
listen, kudos, for sharing your story, and
sure,
it sounds really terrifying. And so I have to ask one question. So part of the therapy is to write this confession letter. I mean, you ever think like, what if somebody finds this confession letter? And
of course. Yeah, of course. But that's sort of the part of the therapeutic acceptance is,
right. I guess you're confessing also to something that never happened ultimately.
Exactly. There's no actual crime here.
Right. So that's the piece that I was missing, I guess, there.
Well, exactly. I mean, there's no, right. It's a confession letter. It's not it's confessing to your false greatest fears. I know it's so counterintuitive. But of course you worry like, well, what if someone finds this and finds out I'm having these thoughts? But it's part of the acceptance of the process to just be like, well, okay, it's out there. And, even with writing the article for Huffington Post that you found, it's like, there was an element of that, like, but I really thought it through. I really considered the way I wrote it and what I said. And I decided that, that it was therapeutically sound. Does that make sense? I wanted to write it, but I wanted to make sure it was truthful and in line with my experience and with my treatment. And so even though I haven't worked with a therapist for a few years now, I took the time to make sure it was therapeutically sound. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, you're preaching to the choir. I mean, I think it's these kind of cathartic pieces that you write are
totally.
Yeah, they are just, they help just take a weight off your shoulders. That
completely.
You know, I went through something, nothing like what you went through, but I had, you know, a difficult period in my life, and everybody does. And
everybody, yeah, but.
And I had a couple of panic attacks and a period of, you know, where I was very anxious and
sure, yikes,
depressed.
Yeah.
And I never told anybody about it for the longest time. And it you know, when I started to tell people about it, the most amazing thing was that so many people told me they had gone through similar things. And, you know, what I went through was nothing as, you know, unique and acute as what you went through.
It's not a competition, you know?
No. But my point is, I think, you know, you could probably tell a lot of people and they might not have the same reaction I had, which was like, oh yeah, I had a panic attack also. I went to the emergency room, and, you know, I've had some, you know, a very stressful period where people might not understand what you went through, but by writing it and putting it out there, now people can be compassionate and understand what you've gone through. And
right. And you know, interestingly, I did get that response of, hey, you know, I've had, and you know, there can be a spectrum. I was sort of suffering from it badly. But you know, and even some very close friends that I've known for a long time after I did that article said, hey, you know, I've wondered if I've run over someone in a car and gone back to check, or I've had this kind of thought. And yeah, it just seems so crazy that people don't talk about it. So I was surprised at that. You know, I didn't expect to get that response. I thought people would be compassionate and supportive, but I didn't expect so many people that I knew pretty well to say, you know, I've sort of felt like this before. So I think that, you know, as part of a spectrum, I think these kinds of intrusive thoughts and pure you know, I think it's pretty widespread. It seems to be much more widespread than I expected.
Right. Well, I would imagine everybody at some point has had some type of intrusive thought, and
exactly. Well, everybody does. I mean, that's
back. It's
like
to your point. It's the level and the degree and where you are on the spectrum.
And if people get hung up on it, you know, and that's part of the OCD and the anxiety is everybody. You know, because I've really read up on this and done a lot. So everybody has intrusive, disturbing thoughts, and some people just, you know, pay it no mind and just in and out, you know, and people with the pure O or people with tendencies towards anxiety, then they can get hung up and obsessed on.
Yeah, we are complicated creatures. There's a lot going on up there, no doubt. I mean, you know, thank you so much for sharing your story, by the way. This, I think, will end up helping a lot of people, and you know, that's what I know you're aiming to do and I'm aiming to do with this. So how about telling us what you're doing now? Let's put the pure O aside, and you have some interesting projects, and just give us a little bit about what you're doing.
Sure. Well, it's sort of in between, though. I really wanted to mention, you know, that I also have and do still suffer from sort of regular anxiety, I would call it, you know. Again, much like I mentioned in that therapeutic process, learning to differentiate between what's a OCD spike and what's maybe, even if it's remote, a legitimate concern or fear. I've sort of learned, especially since my treatment, to differentiate between what I would call almost I call it like toxic anxiety, like this OCD panic that is so overwhelming and so painful, and sort of normal anxiety, of which I also suffered. And so, interestingly and luckily, this OCD therapist who I was working with, who was amazing, is also, and I just want to mention this because I believe it relates to
you. No, please, absolutely. Let's, you know.
He was also interested in a practitioner of mindfulness and meditation. And though that's not used as a direct treatment for pure O, it can be a nice corollary. And so we talked some about that, and he got me into that. So again, not just to treat the pure O, but sort of just to help the whole, you know, help my whole package, my whole body.
Yeah.
And so I developed some of those skills also working with him. And then a couple years after I was done with treatment, I was fortunate enough to get a book deal for this book's Cool, which you mentioned earlier in the
Yeah.
bot. And we had a really tight, I worked on it with a partner, with my friend Greg, who's an amazing artist and illustrator. And we had a really tight turnaround, a really tight deadline. And it really stressed me out. And I got super anxious about it. And then right before we were really needing to dive into the work, and I mean, I had it planned down almost to the hour. It was that tight. You know, it was like, we have 3 months to turn this around, and it's a ton of work. I also, unfortunately, broke my ankle sort of right before that. So I was like set back a little bit, and also sort of like, I mean, not totally trapped, but you know, kind of just like in my apartment writing. And I got close to panic there too. But of course, fortunately from the treatment, I'd known that this was, you know, this is, you know, you might be overreacting, but are you not going to turn your book in on time? That's legitimately a possibility. So that's a real fear. So, you know, so the pure exposure treatment isn't going to work for this anxiety, but the mindfulness did. And so, you know, in doing mindful meditation pretty much every day, and you know, being disciplined and sort of trying to integrate it into my life as much as possible, and especially into my work, it really allowed me to do the book. I mean, I really don't know if I would have been able to do it without it, because the anxiety was really bad. And of course, as I'm sure, as you know, as someone who suffered as well, that just takes up all your energy. You can't really do your best work when you're sapped by anxiety, whether it's like sapping 25% of your mental and physical energy, or if it's sort of the whole thing. And so somehow that allowed me to just calm down and, you know, be mindful as I worked through it, instead of being overwhelmed by the deadline and the amount of work that was hanging over my head. Just really approach it day to day, minute by minute. And so I've found that mindfulness and meditation to be really, really helpful, sort of to my other forms of anxiety too.
Absolutely. I'm not sure actually if you're aware, but I am a mindfulness practitioner and teacher. So
I am. That's why I wanted to make sure.
Oh, great.
I knew that it directly related to your work.
Yeah, I often say it might have saved my life. You know, no doubt, mindfulness. And to your point, one of my teachers said to me a long time ago, with mindfulness, it's like taking out the mental garbage. So, you know, for you to be on this deadline, you practice some mindfulness and you meditate and you incorporate it into everything you do. You know, it clears your head, and it all of a sudden you can probably write more effectively and be much more productive.
Exactly. And one of the big breakthroughs for me that was sort of a self-realization, and since I've done this, I've talked to other people and they said they felt similarly, is that almost like with the book deadline, the idea of meditation and mindfulness can seem so all-encompassing, and you know, I have to meditate for an hour. Right. I have to do this perfectly, and then you're stressed out about it.
Exactly.
It's not going to be functional. And so I guess I think I just sort of figured this out on my own, but I thought, well, okay, I'm going to remove those pressures from myself. I'm going to be disciplined about this, but if some days I'm only meditating for 5 minutes, then that's 5 minutes of mindfulness meditation that I wouldn't be doing otherwise. And so sort of accepting it as something you could fit in as small pieces or here and there, or, you know, be disciplined about it, but incorporate it into the way I was feeling and the way my life was like a revelation to me. It was like, oh, you don't have to do this for an hour and a half of total perfectness. You know, you don't have to set these high standards for yourself and overwhelm yourself and defeat the purpose. And so being able to integrate it into my life sort of, you know, as best I could was so helpful. It was such
I mean, you touch on an important point. I think a lot of people that might not be interested in starting a mindfulness practice just think of it as, oh boy, you know, something else that I need to do. You know?
Exactly. That's how I felt. Exactly.
And there are just ways you can incorporate it into your life. I mean, you know, mindfulness is just another term for awareness, and cultivating this higher level of awareness of your thoughts and your feelings and your emotions. And you can do that while you're eating or drinking a cup of coffee or walking,
exactly.
or
Exactly. And
sitting on the subway. People say you meditate while you're on the subway.
I was just gonna say
all the time. All the time.
Same here on the subway. And sometimes it's on the subway, sometimes it's just a couple minutes. But again, it's like
it's powerful though. It really is. It's a very powerful practice when you learn how to incorporate it in.
A big relief. And that actually inspired me to make other healthier changes in my life. It's like, well, if you can sort of take your mindfulness practice in bite-sized pieces, maybe you can do that with your diet. You don't have to overhaul your diet completely, but if you're doing X and X and X 1 or 2 days a week, well, it's a positive start and a positive change. And that's just because you're not being 100% disciplined and say eating totally vegan or what have you. It's still a positive, healthful change. And, once you get that once you get that started, I found it easier to build on that.
Yeah, things tend to snowball. No doubt about it. Exactly. I agree 100%.
Being perfect or what have
you. Yeah. No such thing. No such thing as being perfect.
Exactly.
Yeah. So Andrew, why don't you just actually tell us a little bit about your book before we wrap this up? Your book, Cool: Sound, Style, and Subversion: A History of Youth Subcultures.
Sure. So, Cool, Style and Sound and Subversion is, a history of youth subcultures. I worked on it with my friend Greg Foley, who is an incredible illustrator and art director of some magazines here in New York. He's also a children's book author. He just published a book called Cat Writes a Song. It's amazing. I'd been a fashion editor at Esquire and a fashion writer and a trend forecaster for some pretty big companies. And Greg is the husband of one of my best friends, this woman, Shannon. And one night we just got to talking. He said, you're publishing so much digital content there at Esquire, so much online. If you could do a book, if you could do something in print, what would you do? And I said, I've had this idea to do a book about youth subcultures for a couple years. And I've sort of been keeping notes, and I already have a list of 100 subcultures. And he said, I've had kind of the same idea. So, look, you write it and research it. I'll illustrate it, and I'll use, since he'd already published some children's books and some art books, so I'll use my connections and I'll try and get us a deal. And so we put together a proposal and we got a deal. But yeah, it's it's the first of its kind. It's 100 years of youth subcultures, starting 1920s with flappers, going all the way up to we published it in 2017. So basically up to now. It's told through the lenses of fashion and music. We have a lot of music and playlists in there.
Cool.
Yeah, playlists, dating. We basically have a 20-song playlists for every important genre of popular music from the 20s until today. And we were able to get in contact with some famous musicians to add their input. So like, Marky Ramone from the Ramones gave us a 5-song punk playlist. And,
wow.
Yeah. We were really fortunate, really cool. Like Ice-T gave us a rap playlist.
That's awesome.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's kind of blowing me away. And then we were also able to strike a little deal with Apple Music. So we've got all those playlists up there streaming online for people to subscribe to Apple Music. So it turns it into sort of an extra resource for the book that lives on outside of it. And yeah, it's been amazing. I'm super grateful. We're still doing talks and events and things like that to promote it. And it's going into its second printing. It's with Rizzoli, which is a great publisher. And outside of that, I basically freelance. So I do some freelance writing, usually on fashion and cultural things, but I've been trying to branch out, like the HuffPo article about the OCD. And then I still do some freelance, like trend forecasting, working with companies to sort of let them know what the next thing is, and also some freelance copywriting and styling. So I've been really fortunate to be able to mix all of those interests together. And with the freelance flexibility, I also have Monday afternoons off to do cool stuff like that.
That's awesome. Well, hey, thanks so much for being here again, Andrew Luecke. And thanks to the viewers and listeners for tuning into this edition of the Don't Panic Project. You can find more great conversations at www.thedon'tpanicproject.com or on our YouTube channel. And now you can also listen on iTunes. My name is Jim Posner. I work with smart, forward-thinking individuals, corporations, schools, and athletes to help them harness the power of mindfulness to achieve peak performance and manage stress. See you next time on the Don't Panic Project.
Thanks, Jim.
Thank you.